The candle had burned to a stub before Esther found the first shape of the lie. It was past 2 in the morning, and the steward's room at Thornbury Hall held nothing but the smell of cold ash and old ink, and the ledger open beneath her chapped hands showed a column of figures that did not agree with themselves. Michaelmas rents from the 4 tenant farms of the Lower Valley, recorded in one book as £312, recorded in the second book, the one kept locked, as £270. She was only a housemaid. She had no business with either book, yet her father had taught her to read a tally before he taught her to read her letters. And a difference of £42 does not vanish into a fair copy by accident. She closed the ledger and pressed her palm flat against the cover, as if the leather could tell her she had imagined it, somewhere above her in the great sleeping house a floorboard settled. She thought of the man who kept that locked book, and of what his face would do if he found her here. And she blew out the stub before the light could betray her under the door. You have perhaps noticed in your own life how a small wrong thing, seen once, cannot be unseen. Stay with her a while. She is about to learn how heavy £42 can be. The morning after came grey and ordinary, as mornings do. Esther Vane rose at 5:30 in the maid's garret under the eaves, laced herself into a gown the colour of weak tea, and went down the back stairs to lay the fires before the family stirred. She was 23 years old, and she had been at Thornbury Hall for 11 months, and in that time she had learned the exact number of steps between the scullery and the morning room, and the precise weight of a coal scuttle carried up 2 flights without waking a house. She had learned other things, too. She had learned which footman drank, and which laundry maid wept, and which door in the west corridor did not lock. She kept all of it behind her teeth. A servant who speaks is a servant dismissed, and Esther had nowhere to be dismissed to. Her father had been a tenant farmer once on land in Somerset that was no longer theirs. He had kept his own accounts in a hand as neat as any clerk's, and he had died owing nothing to any man, which was the only estate he left her. That and a small brass tally stick, worn smooth at both ends, notched down one side in the old way, that she carried sewn into the hem of her petticoat because she owned nothing else worth the sewing. When she was frightened, she pressed it through the cloth with her thumb. She was pressing it now in the grey kitchen, as the undercook set the porridge to warm, and the great bellboard on the wall waited for the first pull of the day. The house belonged to the Earl of Hailwick, and the Earl of Hailwick had been in residence for exactly 6 weeks. He had come to a house that did not expect him. The old Earl, his uncle, had died the winter before, and the title and the crumbling acres had been meant for another man entirely. For the old Earl's son, who had gone to sea as a lieutenant, and had not come back, so the estate had passed sideways, and, unwilling to a nephew who had spent his life as a second son, expecting nothing, a man of 39 with a soldier's straight back and a face that gave away as little as a shut gate, Adrian Marsh, Earl of Hailwick, walked his own corridors like a guest who had not yet been shown to his room. The servants watched him and could not read him. He did not raise his voice. He did not lower it, either. To the household below stairs he was already decided. He was cold. That was the word that had settled on him within a week, passed from the still room to the stable in the easy currency of servants' talk. "Cold as the north face of the chapel," said Mrs. Pruitt, the cook, stirring, not unkindly, only certain. "He'll not stay past the spring. His sort never does. Too grand for us, and too poor to know it." Esther said nothing. She had seen the Earl exactly 4 times, and each time he had been standing very still at a window, looking at the grounds as though counting something he could not afford to lose. She did not think that was coldness. She did not know what it was. She had learned not to say the things she thought. The butler was another matter. Mr. Pross. Crandall had governed the below-stairs world of Thornbury Hall for 22 years, through the old Earl's long decline and the strange sideways inheritance, and now the arrival of a master who did not yet know where the silver was kept. He was a tall, spare man with a smooth grey head and a voice like a door closing softly. He knew the house, as a surgeon knows a body. He knew which chimneys smoked, and which tenants paid late, and which of the maids could be trusted with the good china, and he knew the locked ledger in the steward's room because he was the one who kept it locked. The steward himself, old Mr. Fenn, had grown too blind to check a column, and had for 2 years signed whatever Crandall set before him, grateful to be spared the candlelight. Esther knew none of the particulars yet. She knew only that Mr. Blank's Crandall was unfailingly correct with her, which frightened her more than shouting would have. A man that careful, she thought, was a man with something to be careful about. It was Crandall who gave her the errand that undid everything. On the 3rd Thursday of her 12th month, he sent her to the steward's room to carry down a box of old correspondence for burning, and she went, and the locked book was not locked, because Mr. Fenn had left it open on the desk and shuffled away to his supper. Forgetting it entirely, Esther saw the open page, the way one sees a snake on a path. All at once, and against her will, she saw the Lower Valley rents. She saw the fair figure, and she saw on the loose sheet tucked beside it in a different, finer hand, the true figure. And her father's daughter did the arithmetic, before her father's daughter could stop herself. £42. This quarter alone she carried the box down and burned the correspondence and said nothing to anyone, and that night she went back. She should not have. She knew it as she went, knew it in the cold of her bare feet on the back stair, and the pressure of the tally stick against her thumb through the petticoat hem. A wrong thing, seen once, cannot be unseen, and Esther had spent 11 months keeping other people's secrets, and this one was not a servant weeping or a footman drinking. This one had a shape she recognized from Somerset, from the year the agent bled her father's neighbors dry and called it rent. She had watched good men lose their land to a difference in a column. She could not carry this one behind her teeth and sleep. So she read. She was careful. She copied nothing. She moved nothing. She left each page as she found it, and she used only the light of the moon through the tall window, so that no candle would betray her. Over 3 nights she pieced it together. For 2 years the rents of the 4 lower farms had been recorded short in the master ledger and full in the true accounting, and the difference had gone nowhere she could name, and the tenants who paid it entire were being pressed as though they paid it short. Old Harrow at Nethercote had been threatened with the loss of his lease for arrears he did not owe. His arrears were sitting in someone's pocket. On the 3rd night she understood whose. She found folded into the back of the true book a receipt for a debt of £200 owed by one Josiah Crandall to a moneylender in Bath, and the dates of the repayments marched in step with the quarter days like soldiers. She sat back on her heels in the moonlight and felt the house breathing around her, and understood that she now held something that could ruin a man, and that the man could far more easily ruin her. The next morning the Earl was at his window again. She had come to lay the fire in the library, believing the room empty at that hour, and he was there before the cold hearth in his shirt-sleeves, and he turned when the door opened. Esther stopped with the scuttle in both hands, and dropped the small curtsy that was all a maid owed, and would have withdrawn. But he spoke. "You lay the fires," he said. "Not a question." His voice was low and level, and it did not warm the words. "Yes, my lord, every morning. Yes, my lord." He looked at her a moment longer than a master looks at a maid. She was aware in the ridiculous way the body is aware of things the mind has no use for, of the plainness of her gown against the good dark wood of the room, of a smear of coal on her wrist, of the fact that she had not slept. His eyes were gray, a colder gray than the morning, and they rested on her without any warmth at all, and yet without dismissal. And that was the strange thing. That was the thing she carried out of the room with her when he inclined his head and let her go. He had looked at her as though she were a person and not a piece of the furniture that laid the fires. No one in that house had looked at her so. She told herself it meant nothing. Her pulse, foolish and unbidden, disagreed. That afternoon she heard the label for the first time from a mouth that mattered. She was carrying linen along the gallery when she passed the open door of the small parlor where Mr. Colte Crandall stood with the housekeeper going over the week's accounts, and she heard her own description float out on the still air. Unhurried, certain. "The vain girl," Crandall was saying, Steady enough. A drudge, but an honest one. Not the sort to give trouble. No family, no followers, no wit to speak of. A pause, and the soft closing door voice added, almost fondly, "The invisible kind. One scarcely knows she is in a room. The invisible kind." Esther walked on with the linen, her face composed, her steps even, and the words went into her like a splinter under a nail, all the worse for being meant as praise. He thought her a drudge, with no wit. He thought her invisible. She understood, walking, that this was precisely why he had felt safe leaving that book to a blind old man in a house full of servants he did not fear. The invisible kind do not read ledgers. The invisible kind do not do arithmetic in the dark. She pressed the tally stick through her hem and kept walking. And something in her that had been frightened for 3 nights turned quietly to something else. You know that feeling too, I think. The moment of fear you have carried a long while decides, without asking you, to become a purpose. If you have ever felt it, stay with her. She has decided. Deciding is not the same as doing, and Esther had no power in that house at all. She could not go to the steward who signed what he was given and could no longer read what he signed. She could not go to the housekeeper, who had been Crandall's ally for 20 years. She could not go to the tenants who would not take the word of a housemaid against the butler of the hall, and who would only be ruined faster for repeating it. There was one person in the house with the authority to open that book and demand its truth, and he was the coldest man she had ever met, and if she was wrong, or if she could not make him believe her, she would be turned out onto the road without a character, which for a woman alone was a sentence with only one ending. So she watched and she waited for a door. The door, when it came through a child. The Earl had brought with him to Thornbury one small dependent, a boy of 6 called Toby, the son of the dead lieutenant, the cousin's child, orphaned twice over and belonging nowhere in the world but wherever his new guardian carried him. The household did not quite know what to make of a small motherless boy in a house of grief, and the boy did not quite know what to make of any of it, and so he did what unhappy children do, which was to make himself scarce and turn up in the wrong places. He turned up one wet afternoon in the back passage outside the still room, sitting on the cold flags with his knees drawn up, having run from a nursery maid who did not like him. Esther found him there. She was carrying a jug and she nearly stepped on him. And he looked up at her with the particular blank misery of a child who has decided that no one will come. And something in her that had grieved her own losses went straight to him without permission. She did not lecture him or return him. She sat down on the cold flags beside him, jug and all, and she took the brass tally stick from her hem, and she showed him how the old farmers reckoned a debt in notches before there were books, one cut for a shilling, and a longer cut for a pound, and she let him hold it, and she told him it had been her father's, and that her father had been a man who counted things fairly, because counting things fairly was a way of being kind. The boy turned the smooth brass over and over in his small hands, and forgot, for a quarter of an hour, that he belonged nowhere. Then she took him up and dried his face on her apron, and delivered him to the nursery by a route that spared him the nursery maid's temper, and she thought nothing more of it. She did not know that the Earl had come to the head of the back stairs looking for the boy, and had stopped, and had stood in the shadow of the turn for the whole quarter hour, and had watched a housemaid he had spoken 9 words to sit down on a cold stone floor and give a grieving child the only kind thing in his day. He did not come forward. He watched the brass stick turn in the small hands. He watched her show the boy the long notch and the short one, a pound and a shilling, patient as though she had all the afternoon and nothing in the world to fear from a scolding for wasted time. He heard, without meaning to, the low, even voice, telling the child that counting things fairly was a way of being kind, and he found he could not move, because it was the sort of thing his cousin might have said, the sort of plain decency that asked nothing back. He watched her dry the boy's face with the corner of her apron and take him up, as though he weighed nothing. And when she carried Toby away by the back route that spared him the nursery maid's temper, the Earl stood a while longer at the turn of the stair with one hand on the cold rail, and his shut-gate face did something it had not done since a ship failed to come home off Finisterre, and no one saw it. Because the only person who might have seen it had her back to him and a grieving child on her hip. After that, the Earl began, very slightly, to be where she was. It was nothing anyone could have named. He took to walking in the library at the hour she laid the fire, and standing at his window while she worked. And once he asked her in his level voice whether the boy troubled the servants, and she said no. "My lord, he is no trouble, he is only lonely," and the Earl was silent for so long that she thought she had overstepped, and then he said yes, as though she had told him something he had not let himself know. Another morning he found her struggling to lift a fallen log back onto the fire dogs, and he crossed the room and did it himself before she could protest, and set the tongs down and said, "Do not lift what is too heavy for you," and left. And she stood there, with her heart going like a hare's, and told herself it was the surprise. She was not a fool. She knew what her body was doing, and she knew it was hopeless. He was an earl, and she laid his fires. Whatever softened in the cold gray of his eyes when he looked at her could go nowhere and be nothing. And she had a purpose now that mattered more than the foolishness of a pulse. She had old Harrow at Nethercote threatened with the road for arrears he had already paid. She had 4 farms, bled quiet for 2 years. She had a man who thought her invisible. The invisibility, she began to see, was the very thing she could use, because Crandall did not watch her. Why would he watch a drudge with no wit? He let her carry the burning box. He let her lay the fire in the steward's room. He moved through his days secure in the certainty that the invisible girl saw nothing, and so she saw everything. She learned the evening. He rode to Bath with a packet under his coat. She learned the drawer where the true books slept. She learned, most usefully, Fenn signed the fair copy at the library desk in the Earl's presence, a small dry ceremony of trust. The blind steward's pen guided to the line, the Earl adding his own name beneath as master of the estate. The next signing was set for the Friday before Christmas. That was her door. She could not accuse. She could, however, arrange for the Earl to see the 2 figures side by side in the same hour, in his own hand's reach, and let the arithmetic accuse for her. If she was wrong, she would hang for it. Near enough. She spent a week deciding, and pressed the tally stick raw against her thumb, and decided. Here I must tell you the middle of the Earl, because it is the hinge on which the rest turns, and Esther did not learn it until later, though you should have it now. Adrian Marsh had loved exactly one person without reserve in his life, and it had been his cousin, the lieutenant, the man the estate ought to have gone to. They had been boys together in this same house, second son and heir, and Adrian had never envied him, had loved him too plainly for that. When the war took his cousin to sea, Adrian had been the one to press him not to go, and his cousin had laughed and gone, and the ship had been lost off Finisterre with all hands in a January gale, and the letter had reached Adrian on a grey afternoon at a window very like the one he now stood at. He had inherited a house he did not want, from a death he could not forgive himself for failing to prevent, and a small boy who had his cousin's eyes, and he had shut the gate of his face, because behind it was a grief he did not know how to survive. That was the coldness the servants had named. It was not coldness. It was a man standing very still so that he would not come apart. He counted the grounds from the window because counting was a thing he could do when there was nothing else he could do. And when he had watched a housemaid teach his cousin's orphaned son to count fairly with a dead man's brass stick, something behind the gate had turned over and begun, against his will, to want to live again. He did not have words for it. Men of his making rarely do. Yet he began to want the mornings she laid the fire. And to be angry, in a cold, contained way he did not examine, at the thought of anything in his house that would use her ill. He did not yet know his own house was using her ill, in a locked drawer 12 feet from where he slept. The dismissive label came a second time, and this time in public. And this time it was the dowager who spoke it. Lady Marchwood was the old Earl's sister, Adrian's aunt, and she had descended upon Thornbury for the Christmas fortnight with a lady's maid, a mountain of trunks, and the fixed intention of seeing her nephew properly settled before she would consent to think well of him. She had chosen his wife for him already. She had brought the girl with her, in point of fact, a Miss Cassandra Pell, niece of a friend, pretty and polished and possessed of £8,000, arranged along the drawing-room settee each evening like a display of good china. Lady Marchwood ran the household's public rooms as though she had never left them, and she noticed Esther, the way one notices a draft. It happened at the foot of the great stair, where Esther was polishing the newel while the dowager came down to dinner on Crandall's arm. Lady Marchwood paused. She looked at Esther over the top of her fan, and she said to Crandall, not troubling to lower her voice because there was no one present who counted, "One of the housemaids I collect. Does the Earl always let them clutter the front of the house? In my brother's day they kept to the back. This one has a bold eye for a drudge." And Crandall said, soft as a door, "She is quite harmless, my lady." Invisible, one might say. And the two of them went in to dinner, and the word landed on Esther for the second time. In the grand, cold entrance hall, spoken over her head as though she were the newel post she polished. She did not stop polishing. Her hand for a moment went still on the wood, and she thought, he says it to comfort himself. He says it because a man who has hidden £200 needs very much to believe that the girl who laid the fire saw nothing at all, and she went on polishing the newel until it shone. The Friday before Christmas came in with snow. By afternoon it had laid a clean white silence over the park and the drive, and the tenants who had walked up for the quarter-day audience stamped it from their boots in the servants' hall, breath steaming in the cold passage, and old Harrow among them, twisting his hat in his raw hands, come to plead for a lease he could not lose. He was near 70, and his father had farmed Nethercote before him, and his grandson had been born there in the autumn, and he had paid his rent whole every quarter of his life, and could not understand how he had come to owe money he had already handed across a table. Esther brought him a cup of small beer, and did not tell him what she knew. She only watched him turn his hat, and she thought of her own father in a room like this one, twisting his own hat before an agent who held a column of figures like a weapon, and the memory set her purpose harder than any argument could have. Esther watched him from the passage. She knew what she meant to do, and it turned her cold. Colder than the snow. She had arranged one small thing only. The single thing a housemaid could arrange without being seen to arrange it. When the steward's true book was carried up to the library for the signing, it would be carried up by her, and the loose sheet with the real figures, the sheet Crandall always drew out and locked away before the fair copy went up, would still be inside it. She had watched him tuck that sheet away 100 times. Tonight, she would fail to let him. It was the smallest sabotage imaginable. She simply contrived to be the one who fetched the book, and to fetch it a quarter-hour early before Crandall came to strip it, and to carry it up the back stair with the true sheet folded inside, and her heart slamming, and the tally-stick pressed to her thumb, and to set it on the library desk in front of the blind steward and the waiting Earl, and to step back against the wall where invisible girls stand. Crandall came in a moment later, smooth and gray, and saw the book already on the desk, and Esther watched the smallest flicker cross his correct face there and gone, as he understood that the sheet had not been drawn. He could not draw it now. To cross the room and take a paper from under the Earl's hand at the moment of signing would be to make himself seen, and Crandall's whole life was the art of not being seen, doing what he did. He stood by the door with his hands folded and his face composed, and he began, very quietly, to pray. In whatever wordless way such a man prays, that the master would sign without reading, as the blind old steward always signed, and that the snow and the hour and the waiting dinner would carry the moment past. The Earl drew the book toward him. Mr. Fenn's dry hand found the line by long habit, and signed. The Earl took up the pen to add his name beneath and paused, because his eye, an idle eye, a grieving man's eye that counted things because counting steadied him, had fallen on a loose sheet of figures that did not match the figures above it. The room was very quiet. Somewhere below, the fiddle, for the servants' Christmas had begun to tune. "Fenn," the Earl said. What is this sum? The lower valley shows 312 here, and here in this hand it shows 270. He set the two figures beside each other with one finger, master to steward. Level and unhurried, the tenants paid, which the blind old man did not know. He had signed what he was given for 2 years. He began to say so, faltering, and the Earl's gray eyes came up from the page and moved, slowly, to the butler by the door. Crandall's face was a shut gate to rival his master's. "A clerk's error, my lord," he said, soft as ever. "The fair copy corrects it. If your lordship will permit me to take the loose sheet, I shall see the figures reconciled by morning." He stepped forward. Smooth, reaching, and it was the reaching that undid him, because Esther had spent 11 months learning exactly how a careful man moves when he wishes not to be seen, and she knew that reach for what it was. And so, she understood in a rush, did the Earl. "Leave it," said the Earl. 2 words. Level, and the room stopped. Here is the thing Esther had gambled her whole future on, and had no way to be sure of until this moment. She had wagered that a man who counted the grounds from a window, because he could not bear to lose one more thing he was responsible for, would not let £42 a quarter be quietly bled from the tenants in his care. She had wagered on the very quality the house called coldness. She had read him right. The Earl looked at the 2 sums a long moment. Then he lifted his eyes, and found against the wall the housemaid who had carried the book up early, standing very still where invisible girls stand, and he understood the whole shape of it at once. The early book, the undrawn sheet, the maid who did arithmetic in the dark, and the gate of his face opened, only for her, in something that was not coldness at all. "You brought this up," he said to her. Not an accusation. The room turned to look at the drudge by the wall. Esther's mouth was dry. She thought of her father, who had died owing nothing to any man. "Old Harrow at Nethercote has paid his rent entire for 2 years, my lord," she said, and her voice did not shake, which surprised her. "He is downstairs now to beg for the lease he never owed arrears. On the 4 lower farms have paid whole and been recorded short. The difference has gone to Bath." She did not name the debt. She did not need to. She had learned that the sufficient thing is the true thing, said once, and left in the silence to do its work. The silence did its work. Crandall did not fragment all at once. Men so long-armored seldom do. He said, "My lord, you will not take the word of a housemaid," and even as he said it, the sentence failed under him, because the word of the housemaid was sitting on the desk in his own true hand, and the Earl was looking not at Esther now, but at the receipt from Bath that had slid from the back of the book when the steward signed. The dated repayments marching in step with the quarter days, and Crandall saw him see it, and the soft closing door voice, for the first time in 22 years, would not close. He said the girl's name once. The vain girl, as though it were an accusation, as though her invisibility had been a promise the world had made him and she had broken. Then he stopped, because there was nothing at the end of the sentence but the truth. "Send Harrow up," the Earl said to the footman at the door, "and send for Mr. Brott. Fenn's clerk and the parish constable can wait in the hall until I have read every page of this book." He rose. He was not loud. He had never once been loud. "Mr. Crandall, you will remain in the steward's room until I send for you. 22 years in this house, and you pressed an honest man for money you had already taken from him." A pause, level and cold and clean. "You will find I am not so blind as my steward." That was all. No striking, no shouting, no more words than the wrong required. The dowager, arriving in the doorway on a wave of outrage at the delay to her dinner, took in the receipt and the butler's gray face, and the housemaid standing where the master's eyes kept returning. And Lady Marchwood, who was many things but not a fool, closed her fan. They found it all, in the reading of the book. 2 years, 4 farms, £390 bled quiet into a debt in Bath. Harrow's lease was made secure that same night, in ink, the Earl's own hand, before the old man had finished twisting his hat. The tenants were repaid what they had, overpaid to the shilling, counted out, and set down in each hard hand across the same library desk where the fair copy had been signed, out of an estate the Earl could scarcely afford. When the steward's clerk questioned the expense, and pointed out that no law compelled a landlord to make good a butler's theft, the Earl looked at him a long moment, and said only that a house which keeps what was stolen for it is a house built on the theft, and that he would not begin his tenure by living in it. He said it in the level voice that no one in that house any longer mistook for coldness. Crandall was gone before the new year, quietly, without the constable in the end, because the Earl found no profit in ruin beyond what justice required, and dismissed him without a character, which for a butler was a road as final as any Esther had feared for herself. And Esther. Esther went back down the stairs that night to a servants' hall. Gone silent as she passed, and lay awake in the garret under the eaves with her father's brass tally-stick warm in her closed hand, and did not know what she had made for herself. She had done the thing. She had not thought past the doing of it. A maid who ruins a butler is not thereby made anything at all. She might yet be turned out. Grand houses do not love a servant who has seen too much, even when what she saw was true. The Earl sent for her on the morning of Christmas Eve, not to the library this time. To the small morning room where he stood at the window with the snow light on his face, and Toby was there seated on the floor with something bright in his hands. And when Esther came in, the boy held it up to her with his whole heart, and it was a tally stick, new cut, notched down one side in the old way, brass, small enough for a child's hand. His lordship had it made, Toby said. So I can count fair like your father. Esther looked at the Earl and could not speak. He did not cross the room in 3 strides, or make a declaration, or say any of the things a lesser man in a lesser story might have said. He was not made for speeches, and he did not attempt one. He said, in the level voice that the house had called cold, and that she now knew, for the sound of a man holding himself very carefully together. I have need of a steward's clerk, Mr. Settery. Fen cannot see, and I cannot count, and it appears the only person in this house who can do both fairly has been laying my fires. A pause. The gate of his face was open now and did not close. Miss Vane, I would rather you did not lay them any more. The marked thing, the thing she carried out of the room and kept. It was the first time he had used her name. She might have said many things. What she said was the true thing, said plainly, because she had learned that the true thing said once is the sufficient thing. My father counted fairly because it was a way of being kind, she said. I should like to work for a house that does the same. So should I, said the Earl. I find I am only now learning how. He did not touch her. It was not the hour for it, and they were neither of them people who took what was not yet theirs to take. He looked at her across the morning room with the snow coming down beyond the glass, and the child between them turning the little brass stick over in his hands. And the look was not the look a master gives a maid. It was the look of a man who has counted from a window everything he was afraid to lose, and has found one more thing to be afraid of losing, and has decided, for the first time since a ship failed to come home, that he would rather be afraid than empty. Esther felt her pulse foolish and unbidden and no longer hopeless, and did not tell it to be still. The winter went on, and the arrangement held, and became without either of them naming it aloud for a long while. Something more than an arrangement. She learned the books and set them straight. He learned to sit in a room with another person and not stand apart at the window. The boy grew less scarce. Lady Marchwood took Miss Pell and her £8,000 back to town in the new year, having pronounced her nephew hopeless, which he was, in the way she meant, and mended, in the way she did not understand. The tenants of the 4 lower farms had a landlord now, who read every column himself. An old Harrow at Nethercote lived to see his grandson born on a lease no one could take. It would be a year and more before the Earl asked her plainly, in the same morning room, in the same level voice gone slightly unsteady, to be his wife, and longer still before the county forgave him for it, and never at all before Esther stopped being surprised each morning to wake in a room with a fire someone else had laid. That, though, is beyond the edge of the story, and the story ends where the ledger closed. It ends on the evening they finished the last of the reckoning. The true figures set at last beside the fair ones and made to agree. Every farm paid whole, every column honest. The locked book unlocked for good. The Earl signed the final page, and Esther beside him drew a line beneath the last sum, in her neat clerk's hand, her father's hand, and set down the pen. The fire was low and warm. The snow had begun again beyond the tall window. In the next room the boy had left a small brass tally stick on the hearth, notched down one side, catching the firelight, warm to the touch when she picked it up on her way to bank the coals. She closed her hand around it, the way she had closed her hand around her father's on 100 frightened nights, and found that her hand was not frightened anymore. Thank you for staying until the end. If Esther's quiet courage stayed with you, I hope it keeps you good company on your own cold nights. Some things once seen cannot be unseen, and some of them, seen by the right person, become the beginning of a home.